The poet Robert Frost described the woods as lovely, dark and deep. A metaphor, no doubt, but one that serves our critique very well, as ultimately it was a book that lured Anderson into the deep, dark woods of English lore. There is no doubt that literature can inspire great albums. Pink Floyd's Animals, Tales from Topographic Oceans by Yes, and of course it was a book that kick-starts Tull's rustic period. Songs from the Wood explores the more romantic and, dare I say, supernatural elements associated with these narratives, as Anderson regales the listener with a glimpse of a world lost to power lines and changing times. Some have said there is something inherently hippyish about this Back to the Garden vibe, but I fundamentally disagree. That's a misunderstanding of what's being attempted here. Not to mention Anderson's disdain of the counterculture, so that reference would probably have him choking on his cup of mead. This is not a metaphor, this is not championing an idealistic state of things, but rather an exploration of the myth and whimsy of the English countryside. If we contrast Songs from the Wood with Heavy Horses, on the former Anderson assumes the role of storyteller and explores the folklore of the British Isles, whereas with Heavy Horses the tone is darker, and the focal point is the realities of rural existence, the survival of traditions and the threat posed by technological advancement. We get a whiff of that on Songs from the Wood with Jack in the Green, with power lines and motorways and changing times he sings about. But he's very quick to point to the grass growing for the pavement today as a metaphor for the irrepressible force of the natural world. But on Heavy Horses, such optimism becomes a veiled hope. Now you're down to the few, there's no work to do, the tractor's on its way, he sings. Emphasising to a certain extent what Thomas Hardy spoke of as the ache of modernity, and therein lies the difference between these two albums. Whereas Songs from the Wood is populated with sprites and woodland creatures, legend and lore, it has a Midsummer Night's Dream quality to it. Whereas Heavy Horses is mired in the tempest, the mud and sweat of rural life, with the focus on folklore and festivity, not to mention David Palmer's, or Ned D. Palmer I should say now, wonderful energetic keyboard counterpoint. This ultimately refreshes the Jethro Tull sound. All music has described this as the prettiest Jethro Tull record, and they certainly have a point. We get some intriguing musical textures explored on this record, from the a cappella opening of the title track to the sweaty riff of Hunting Girl, not to mention the guitar dronings of Pibroch. This album feels like a million miles away from the vignettes of Aqualung, the stillness of the gallery, and even narratives about clapped out old greasers. And all this whilst punk was pogoing its way across the British Isles. Those phlegmy upstarts decrying no future from the city tenement blocks, whilst Anderson invites us to feasts of lute songs and chilling ale, all accompanied by the flutings of the portative pipe organ and Barrymore Barlow thumping away at his knackers. As David Rees says in his book on Jethro Tull, if you can't beat them, ignore them. Anderson invites us to pull up a chair and join in the chorus if we can, to celebrate and connect with the natural world in Jack in the Green, myth and archetype in Cup of Wonder, as well as the genial ring-out solstice bells and the Whistler, not meaning to downplay the darker elements in Velvet Green, or the naughty goings-on of the horsey set in Hunting Girl. But nevertheless, the album interestingly ends with a song that depicts genuine heartbreak with Pibroch cap in hand, and genuine contentment in Fires at Midnight. There is generally a disrobing with this album, a kind of authenticity, I think, an exploration of English identity at some level, even if it's at the level of myth and folklore. And Anderson invites us to embrace this new manifesto, especially in the line, "Let me dust you down from tip to toe." One critic has written it's a craving for simplicity and clarity in a confused and confusing world. It's a universal theme. Of course, Ray Davies had previously explored this through his message of preservation. But this idea of returning to something authentic, woodsy and real is one that could perhaps strike a chord with today's generation, a generation lost to the the obscuring globalist pottage of modern politics. The desire to lose ourselves in galliards and lute songs is perhaps never more pertinent than it is now, and we can lose ourselves in this wonderful music, this melange of acoustic strummings, flute wheezings and hand claps. Of course, after the muddled attempt at a kind of rock opera, or rock musical I should say, Too Old to Rock and Roll, before then of course we got the quite mainstream musings of War Child, and let's not forget the critical mauling that a Passion play received. There seemed to be a desire, I think, artistically to press the reset button. And this reset came in the form of the tumbling into Anderson's lap of the book by Russell Ashe called Folklore, Myths, Legends of Britain. This provided a firm signpost into the deep, dark woods of English folklore. The book, of course, was given to Ian by their then manager, Joe Lustig, a man described by Anderson as lovable but often infuriating, who nevertheless influenced the artistic direction of this band by the giving of this book as a gift. The writing was perhaps on the wall. Anderson was showing some interest in folk, although I think he's expressed a dislike for folk music. He had produced the Steel Eye Span album. In fact, Steel Eye Span had supported Jethro Tull on the Passion Play tour. Nevertheless, Anderson is keen to distance himself from the vernacular of traditional folk. Ian Anderson himself said, "So while Steel Eye Span captured the authenticity of English folk, I really had little interest in doing that. Here and there you'll hear little pastiche elements, things like the rhythmic impulse of jigs and reels, or maybe melodies that are evocative of folky sounding things. Combine this with Anderson at this time moving to the country with his then new wife. The ground seemed to be well furrowed for an album of this type. An album inspired in part by leisurely walks in rural Buckinghamshire. So take a British rock band, throw in a book on folklore and myth, and a well-timed move to the countryside, and hey presto, what do you get?" So if you'll forgive me for referring to my notes, let's talk about the tracks on this album. The title track, Songs from the Wood, is an a cappella madrigal that opens the album. It's a striking departure from what Tull had done before this. This song very much puts the cards on the table for the rest of this album, an album which I'm not so sure is a concept album, but maybe a themed album. The opening track serves as an invitation to the listener. Let me bring you songs from the woods. Anderson has said that the lyric about being a singer with kitchen prose and gutter rhymes is supposed to be a little bit self-deprecating. There were two versions of the song, of course, the version that originally makes the album, and an extended version which also makes for an interesting listen. Jack in the Green is a song that's done in a single day, and it's a track that sings of rebirth and renewal. It's a symbol of the irrepressible spirit of nature itself, a staunch ally in the battle against the encroachment of urban sprawl, which rather than harness often looks to erode and subjugate the natural world. With Cup of Wonder, there's a lot of pagan symbolism here. This is a rich weaving of a multitude of voices and instruments, from lutes and whistles and rhythmic complexities and hand claps and all sorts of gubbings going on. Anderson has said that this is quite a difficult song to play, so we never actually did it live. The cup, of course, refers to ancient times and rituals related to turning points in the year. Those turning points are celebrated, and thanks are given to nature for sustaining us by drinking red wine, crimson wonder, or mead, honey, wine made from the fruits of the land. During the ceremony, the chalice is passed round, representing the feminine aspect of nature, hence pass the lady. Join in Black December Sadness, a line August Welcome Corner references the dark month of December and the winter solstice. I think there are also allusions here to the Celtic festival of Lunsa. Hunting Girl opens with that fabulous and dramatic riff that has the hair standing up at the back of your neck. And Anderson's lyrics are deliciously and figuratively erotic. Lines like, "She took this simple man's downfall in hand, I raised the flag that she unfurled." It's a real up Pompeii moment there. This was one of the tunes that was not inspired by the book, but was rather inspired by the settings that Anderson found himself in rural Buckinghamshire. It's a kind of an exploration of human folly in the horsey set, which Anderson said he felt somewhat alienated from. Interestingly, for the guitar sound, Martin Barr used a pedal that he borrowed from Dan Lowe, who was the guitarist in the Canadian band called Hammersmith. Velvet Green is perhaps the darkest song on this album, And for some reason it reminds me of the implied rape of Tess in Tess of the D'Urbervilles. Interestingly, alt-rock chick, she describes it as a gruesome tale of abuse sandwiched between idyllic images where sex is described as a joyous expression of natural instinct. Must admit, Anderson's voice does have a kind of a lusty menace here.
Now let me tell you that it's a lot of love, just lust.
And the writing is in the first person, which makes it more effective. Whistler is a genial piece of flutery, or penny whistle. Interestingly, Anderson had a serious dose of the shingles when they came to filming the video for this, which is why he had to film it sitting down. Overall, a beautiful arrangement with complex and contrasting rhythms. Pibroch is a sad story of a man who comes home to find that his place has been usurped by an intruder, not to mention his bed and his wife. Anderson says it's a sorrowful song that's a very Scottish feel to it, being based on the magpie lament, the Pibroch, which is usually played by a lone piper in some sort of contemplated context, often in honour of somebody, perhaps a death on a battlefield. D. Palmer has said that, and for Pibroch Cap in Hand, which is one of my favourite tracks on the album, the contrapunctual and fugue synthesis stuff is all in the middle was mine. Fire at Midnight is a wonderful, cosy little number that paints a very comfortable picture of a rural farmhouse. Interestingly, the original recording of Fire at Midnight had a kind of a rocky intro to it, with an opening drum break and some lead guitar. Anderson quite rightly decides to go for the shorter version because the intro adds absolutely nothing to this song. Ring Out Solstice Bells was the first song recorded for the album. However, the record company had reservations, and they were uncomfortable with the time signature of the number, so they drafted in Mike Batt, and they re-recorded the song in 4/4 time and retitled it Magic Bells, cynically just in time for Christmas. And this album would prove to be the first of some would say a trilogy of albums, which includes Heavy Horses and even Stormwatch with its wider exploration of the natural world. And I, like many Tull fans, are just happy to embrace the hey nonny nayness of it all. Anyway, you've been watching a critique by Classic Album Review. Please do click like, subscribe, share this video, and click that notification bell. It all helps the algorithm. Other than that, I hope you're well, staying safe, but more importantly that you keep listening.